The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Power outages, fires, and PG&E.
State Senator Jerry Hill is here to talk about all that and more. The game is politics and policy. The game is on.
Hi, I'm Kevin Mullen.
And I'm Mark Simon. Welcome to the game.
While fire recently swept through Sonoma County, fires caused by PG&E equipment, power outages swept through the Bay Area, necessary, according to PG&E, to prevent more fires. Meanwhile, calls are mounting to force PG&E into public ownership and perhaps break up one of the nation's oldest and once well-regarded utilities.
No one has done more to hold PG&E accountable than State Senator Jerry Hill, who is here to talk about the power company and perhaps to reflect on a career as he nears the end of his 3 decades-long public life. It started when you were 18.
Of course.
Let's talk first about these power outages. Sure. And it's a personal issue for me. Power was out for 4.5 days in my house, and I could never find out when it was going to come back on. Right. Was this a good idea? Was this the right thing for them to do, despite the heat they took? No pun intended.
Well, no, I think it's a necessary thing to do. What has become the model of utilities and electric utilities is San Diego Gas and Electric. San Diego has done this since they had devastating fires in 2007. They have a very strategic and surgical approach to de-energizing their system. So it's not a blanket, so you're not affecting 2 million people as they did at PG&E. So they have a very sophisticated system. PG&E doesn't have that. PG&E did, I believe, failed in their effort, but it is necessary. Because if you have the conditions, and now we're seeing very low humidity, high temperatures, high winds that are extraordinary, and because PG&E has mismanaged and neglected their system and their infrastructure, the conditions are right. Those wires break, and as we've seen, they keep falling even when the power's out, but they don't start a fire. So they have to do it to some extent. They just didn't do it in the right way.
Mm. And we've talked before about PG&E on this show with you. So much of it is about, why weren't they doing this 20 years ago? Why weren't they doing it 10 years ago after San Diego had this experience and showed the way? And it's because there was a change in the culture there, wasn't there?
Yes, there was a culture. And you mentioned, growing up, and for many years, I felt PG&E is a great company. They're always there to help you. They're responsive. The rates are fine. They were a good company. But after the energy crisis, in the year 2000, and their first bankruptcy, they went away from and kind of left the fact of leadership being from the utility industry or engineers, and they moved to financial people as the CEO. The CFOs, chief financial officers, became the chief executive officers. And so they were more concerned about the bottom line than they were about the electrical line or the gas line. And that's really where the culture changed as I see it. So that's a 20-year time frame. We saw it come about in 2010 in San Bruno, when the same conditions that we just found them responsible for in the Camp Fire last year, the most destructive fire, 85 deaths, 14,000 homes lost, where they inspected their lines, but they would fly over them and look at them, or they'd look at them from the ground up. Same thing that occurred in San Bruno. The inspections of that gas line were negligent, inefficient, and ineffective, and they didn't do it the right way. They would fly over that the gas pipe and look down to see if there were dead grass around it, or they would use infrared to read it, or they would drive by. They never did the appropriate, responsible testing, which was hydrostatic testing that was required of that line. They never did it.
You mean get inside the pipe?
Get inside the pipe, pressure test it, because when it exploded, it was only about 10 pounds over what its maximum pressure was. And they're supposed to test it at 150% of the maximum operating pressure. They never did that. They used loopholes to not. So they didn't spend the money. They didn't make the investments in safety or maintenance or inspections. They deferred it and diverted that money to profits and bonuses, because that's the only way they could increase their profit, because they're guaranteed a 10.5% rate of return. So the only way they can increase that is cut expenses. And that's what they were found guilty of. And that's why today, to your second question related to public ownership, I've kind of lost my faith in investor-owned utilities because of this. That profit motive has made such an impact and such a difference in that company that a public or a cooperative, which is what the Mayor Sam Liccardo was talking about, may be a better approach to it.
So what are those models looking forward? You talked about the Liccardo approach. We've heard other folks at the state level talk about state ownership. There's another model, a state-owned corporation like a Tennessee Valley Authority kind of a structure. Where do you think this conversation will evolve in terms of what the actual what this company actually looks like post-bankruptcy, and what the governance will look like, and also, are we going to make any changes on the regulatory front in terms of the oversight? Where do you sense this is moving in terms of the conversation?
Well, I think right now, as we look at PG&E going forward out of bankruptcy, there's a real problem, because the only two proposals before the bankruptcy court today are hedge funds. You have a shareholder hedge fund and a bondholder hedge fund trying to buy it. Their interest, again, is the bottom line. Getting in, getting out, making a large profit. The cooperative or community-owned utility is an approach that gets away from that. State ownership, the problem with that is the state constitution prohibits the state from owning stock in a company. So we couldn't take the company over or buy the stock from the company. There would have to be some other form. That's where the cooperative comes into play and could be a better approach. So right now, I believe we're in trouble if those two models are the two that go forward, because their interest is not a normal rate of return. Their interest is maximizing profits, getting out at a higher share price, and ending that. The regulatory environment, Governor Newsom has made some great selections and appointments to the board. The current president, and the best part is the current president of the PUC isn't someone who has a great background in energy, but she has an extraordinary background in organizational reform. And that's what's so critical about the PUC. One of the reasons it's been ineffective is that it is a slow, cumbersome, operating regulatory body. This will give it the teeth that it's necessary, and hopefully the speed and the efficiency and effectiveness that it can move fast to make the changes.
Well, that's the question. When we talk about turning it into public ownership, municipal ownership, or even the cooperative that the mayor of San Jose is talking about, these aren't always necessarily well-run organizations themselves. I mean, the same people that are running Muni in San Francisco, I'm not sure you could have a lot of confidence how well they'd run a utility.
Well, and that's good, Mark, but you've got SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility,
right.
Palo Alto, Los Angeles is a municipal utility, and they're very good with less rates.
So is it possible for things to go back the way they were 20 years ago when it was a well-regarded, well-run, and publicly interested utility?
And you can make that argument looking at San Diego, because San Diego Gas and Electric has made those investments. They have now a very effective weather monitoring system, cameras on their lines, but it's a much smaller system than PG&E, which kind of, the scale is a lot different. But it can be done. I just don't know if, PG&E has had so many chances and opportunities. You would have thought that after the San Bruno explosion and after the efforts that the legislature and we made to reform it and the PUC at the time, they have a pretty good gas system now, frankly. Yeah. But they ignored their electric system. And we still see those problems coming about because of the culture that they have. And I don't know, it's such a large bureaucracy, you almost look at PG&E as a government in itself in terms of a bureaucratic, cumbersome.
And they have a great gas system at a time when the new trend among cities is to require electricity. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to talk about some other issues with State Senator Jerry Hill. We'll be right back.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's still Kevin Mullen, and we're talking with State Senator Jerry Hill. Let's move on to a couple of other things. I'm sure you had the same experience that all of us do when we're out and about in the community. Everybody's talking about growth, traffic, and housing.
Yes.
Has there been too much growth? Should there be some restraints now on growth on the peninsula? You know, and it's a two-part question, because one part of it is commercial growth, one part of it is housing.
Well, unfortunately, we didn't have this conversation when all of the commercial growth was starting and growing in the peninsula and in the Bay Area, frankly. And that has created a lot of the concern and the problems with congestion and housing. I think we have to manage it better. I think if we're going to add housing, we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to deal with it, to handle that increased population as well as the job growth that's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jerry, I wanted to ask you that Senate Bill 50, Scott Wiener's bill, gets so much attention from local government officials, concerns about undermining local land use and maybe an inflexible approach to how we grow on the peninsula. And I know you and I are going to be engaged in conversations with the senator. The bill's not a finished product, but can you give us a sense how important that bill is in real terms? If it actually becomes law, is that really going to change much? Or should we really be having a broader conversation about what some of the additional barriers are to building housing, like state local finance, Proposition 13, all tricky and sticky issues, but it really is a complex problem around disincentives as well for local governments to build housing. So it's a multifaceted challenge that we face, but it seems like that bill gets so much attention. But hopefully it's a broader conversation that we're all having.
And I hope we do have that conversation. I think we do, but as you know, the legislature kind of takes on it piecemeal and never comprehensively. I think Senator Wiener's SB 50 of last year, or of this year, but of this legislative year, was a stretch for a lot of communities. I met with all of the mayors of the cities that I represent, and we had great conversations about it. I shared those conversations with the senator. I did talk with him a week ago in his effort to amend SB 50, and it seems that he has heard and listened to the concerns of the community. I think everyone has agreed they want housing. They want to correct some of the problems that we've seen. They want to make the opportunities available for people, but they want to do it on their kind of where and how on their own terms to kind of maintain that community value that they have and the community sense that they have. And I think the senator is willing to do that and modify his legislation and amend it in a way that will allow that. So it's not quite as prescriptive. As I heard, just tell us how much housing we need to put here. How much do we have to build and develop? Just don't tell us exactly where it has to go. And
as long as the units are being produced.
As long as the units are being produced, everyone should be happy. And on the natural, on the peninsula, we see most of the development going near the transit hubs in the stations. I mean, San Carlos is a perfect example of what's going on right at the station. I mean, it's a beautiful example and I think a sense of where the community is. So I think we will do the right thing. I think it's just a matter of being maybe a little pressure to make sure that it gets done.
Did Senator Wiener's bill help? It's a little more extreme. Did it help push people in that direction, or do you think they were moving that way anyway?
Well, I think it has helped, because I haven't heard one housing development or any project in the peninsula of the last year that hasn't been referenced to SB 50 or reference it. Well, if we don't do this, the state's going to come in and do it for us. And I don't like that. Having that, but that is, I think, a reality.
Do we have to change how we think about the peninsula in this sense? You got involved in politics in San Mateo at the beginning with a height limit.
Right.
It's clear to me, anyway, and this may be a minority of one, that solving the housing problem is essentially going to mean higher density, higher buildings, especially in places like El Camino and along the transit corridors. Do you think we have to move on from, no more than 3 stories and that sort of thing that we used to have?
I think we do. I think we have to, and I certainly, and you're correct, I was fighting a height limit, but we were talking about 12-story buildings in downtown San Mateo with densities of 144 units per acre, and that was 30 years ago. So, I mean, and that, I believe, is still inappropriate for those areas. But I think we can change and evolve into a larger and a little more dense in those certain areas that we're talking about. But whether we want to destroy or affect single-family neighborhoods, I don't think we're ready for that, and I don't think it's an appropriate way to go. But I think there are enough areas. I mean, we were talking 30 years ago that if you took and developed along the El Camino or the transit corridors, you could solve the housing crisis even then, and I think you could do it now in an appropriate way with appropriate growth.
So we're running short on time on this segment, but quickly, there's a discussion around something called Faster Bay Area, region-wide
Sales tax increase for transportation, but it would be a 2/3 vote across the 9-county Bay Area, but it would fund a whole range of transportation projects. There's been a lot happening in the transportation sector on new funding and so forth. What is your view of that approach, given all the other measures that have gone to the voters in recent history? What is your sense of how the big employers on the peninsula, the big corporate folks, Facebook and Genentech and others, what kind of role they need to play in a measure like this if it were to go forward? And that's a big if.
Well, no, it is a big if, because a 2/3 vote in the legislature is not easy when it's talking about taxes. You know, I think what we've seen, I mean, we are asked annually for tax increases, and we support them in most cases and provide that necessary revenue, whether it's for housing, whether it's for education. I think there's a little fatigue and tax fatigue around, and a 1-cent sales tax increase is a substantial amount of money. And the people who can't afford it the most are those that are moving out of the state because they're the ones that are struggling so much, the lower income people. I think if we're going to be asked to, as citizens, to provide that revenue, there has to be an equal share coming from those corporations and those big businesses that have benefited extraordinarily from this area. And in many cases have helped cause the problems that we're dealing with. So they need to have an equal participating role in that for me to support it as it goes forward.
We're going to take a quick break. We've got a whole bunch of other issues still to talk about with State Senator Jerry Hill. Stick around.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's Kevin Mullen, and we're happy to be joined by State Senator Jerry Hill. I mentioned at the top of the show, 30 years of public service. Is there one thing that really jumps out at you in terms of what it meant to you to be able to serve the public in so many different ways?
Well, the one thing that I find important, and even in the legislature today, I like to solve problems. I like to see something, and generally what I found and learned is I get mad. When I see an injustice or I see something that isn't working or abuse is here or there, I get mad, and then I want to change it and make it better. And so there are a number of issues that has occurred, and I've been able to make the changes necessary, and it feels great.
If there was something you could change about the process of being in public life or the process of how the legislature works in Sacramento, maybe I'm more interested in this than anybody, but what if you could make that change, wave that magic wand, what would it be? What has been that biggest source of frustration about just how the process works being a public policy maker?
It's the influence of money. And it's the influence of money, and I'm not talking about corruption, I'm not talking about bribery, I'm talking about the necessity to have large sums of money to run for office. I mean, when I ran, I raised $1 million, spent $1 million, and then for the Senate, and others invested in that as well, and independent expenditures. And so they all expect something from you from that, and this is a quote that I heard, when they give you money, they invest in you, they want you to do what they say. If you do, you'll go to jail. But if you don't give them a little something for what they invested in, they probably won't help you the next time to get elected. And that to me is the problem, because everyone wants something, and it's the power of the special interests, whether it's the California Medical Association, the California Teachers Association. the California Nurses Association. I mean, I'm just naming a few. The power that they have over elected officials in terms of trying to convince them to do something and wanting them to do something is I believe, and I'm part of it and involved in it, but I find that to be the biggest challenge and obstacle to getting
and
good policy.
First thing you think of when you have a bill idea is which powerful interests are going to oppose this,
exactly,
and are they powerful enough to kill it?
Yes.
When you immediately start to do that kind of a calculation.
Exactly, and if two of them are opposed to it, it's almost impossible to get it passed. And that's CEQA reform. CEQA reform has almost been, it's impossible to make a change because you've got the environmental community opposed to it, and you've got the Building and Construction Trades Council and labor opposed to it, to any changes. So when you have that, if you could maybe pick off one of them, but you're not going to do two.
What's next for Jerry Hill? I mean, we don't want to rush you off the stage. You've got another year in office, but you must be thinking about what you're going to do next. It's been 30 years you've been running for the next office or serving in the one you're in.
I know, and it's been a wonderful time, and I've enjoyed every moment of it, almost every moment. There are times I don't like campaigning that much. You know, I really haven't given a lot of thought. I mean, there are a lot of things out there, but you know, I have sometimes a hard time making a decision, especially on something like that. But I think I'm getting a lot of advice from people that, you know, just find what you really enjoy doing and then move and gravitate towards that, and that should work out nicely. But there are a lot of doors open still, and I still feel I'm young enough to make a difference.
Yeah. And then we've got 5 Democrats and at least 1 Republican running to replace you. What are your thoughts about that Senate race? Are you ready to endorse somebody yet?
Well, I'm not ready yet, but I will in the next year, early in the next year. I think I'll make a decision there. I'm just kind of looking at them, talking with them, kind of deciding where that is. You know, I certainly have a lot at stake in that, because you know, you want someone that can kind of carry on some of your policy ideas and issues, and I want someone who's passionate for public service, passionate to make the change, and someone who can get mad too and make that difference.
What if there's one sort of a piece of advice you'd give to any of them, both as candidates and eventually as one of them wins, what would it be?
Well, I think in terms of advice as a candidate is to really just be yourself. 1, 2, don't be beholden to any of those special interests that we're talking about, because they will want to control a lot of what you do. I mean, they may support you to help get you elected, but then afterwards, and I've always looked at it, if I vote 100% with any group, I must be doing something wrong. Because I'm not thinking. Because they're, in some cases, they are so committed to their focus that, and their direction, that they're not really, I believe, looking at the bigger picture, and that's really the role, I think. You have to look and balance all of the needs of the community, and you need to have a good sense of the community. I think Kevin has a wonderful sense of the district he represents. In 30 years, I think I understand what the community is, tolerance level is on certain things, what their focus is, what their priorities are, and I try to reflect that, and I hope that's what they can do.
What's the biggest piece? You got a year still. We're not, as I said, we're not trying to rush you off the stage. What's the biggest piece of unfinished business for you?
Well, one of the things that I want to really work hard on this year, and we've already started, and I had legislation last year that I had to stop and cease, and it kind of goes back to when I started. When I was mayor of the city of San Mateo in 1994, we had the first ordinance in the state, first or second, that banned smoking in restaurants. Hard to believe that you could do that, bars, and in the workplace. It was the first one, and I took a lot of heat for that. But it's something that has always touched me. And last year and this next year, we have legislation that will prohibit any of the flavored tobacco products, and whether it's an e-cigarette or it's a regular cigarette, because that's what children, minors are gravitating to. And so that would be just prohibit all flavored products in tobacco.
Let me ask you another. Just in this morning's paper, we saw that the group that put rent control on the ballot in 2018 is going to try again. What are your thoughts about rent control, in particularly in the light of the bill that was passed that tried to at least address the issue of dramatically rising rents?
Well, I think that and certainly voted in support of that. The governor was behind that. And I think what's significant about that is the California Apartment Association did not oppose it. I mean, they have always been very concerned, very sensitive to the issues that affect their industry and their members. In this case, I think they looked at the broader picture, and this reflects that. I think it was a measured approach. I think it was a good approach. I don't know if this initiative is going to make it. It does make some major changes, especially for those projects that are built and constructed in the last 15 years that would be affected by the initiative and affected by any rent control. But I just think we did a good job. I think let's see how it works and plays out. And I think, frankly, as we're seeing, the market will make a difference in that as well.
We've got about 30 seconds left. Let me ask you quickly, there will be a measure on the ballot next year to make changes to Prop 13, in particular to try and address the concern people have that commercial property has gotten away with dramatically lower tax increases and that the burden is shifted to residential. You share that view? Do you think that's a good idea, that initiative?
Well, I think that we need to do something with the Prop 13 related to commercial property. And I frankly haven't read the initiative, but I think that if it's written in the correct manner, doesn't affect, because my concern is if you raise the property tax on certain businesses, that then they will just pass those costs on to the tenants and to the consumer. So I think it needs to be measured, but I think it needs to be changed.
Yeah. Jerry Hill, thank you as always for being with us. Hopefully we'll have you on a couple more times. Kevin and I are going to do a live election night show on the March 3rd primary, and we're going to put Jerry on the spot and say you got to come on election night for openers. Yeah. But in the meanwhile, thank you for being with us, and thank you for being with us. I'm Mark Simon.
And I'm Kevin Mullen.
Join us next time on The Game.